Khorne here, and today we will be ranking every faction currently present in the game based on just how strong they are on the single player campaign map. Things we will take into consideration when ranking these factions will be just how quickly they can snowball, how strong their armies are, how strong their economy is, how much their faction bonuses and unique mechanics impact their campaign, and how strong their faction leader is. Things we will not be taking into consideration is how strong they can be when they confederate the other legendary lords. Now, I will take into consideration how quickly they can confederate, as some of these factions are much stronger than they should be because of that. I will also try and leave out as much bias as I can, but considering this is based mostly off of my own experience, some might get through. Now, I will be ranking these factions in 5 categories. Game breaking, where these factions just don't play the same game as everybody else. The campaign isn't a battleground for them, but rather a playground, and they are the biggest bullies in it. There are only 2 factions here, and I think you can all pretty much guess which ones. Next we have the overpowered ranking, where every faction is ridiculously strong, almost to the point where the campaign just becomes trivial. If played correctly, they can just waltz through any campaign with ease, and there are very few things that can slow you down. Then we have the strong ranking, where there is finally some semblance of game balance, and these factions are decently strong on the campaign map, with very good bonuses that help them out a lot, but not to the point where their campaign just becomes trivial very early on. Then we have the mediocre ranking, where factions struggle to gain any sort of relevance on the campaign map. Whether it's because of their slightly weaker armies, slightly weaker economy, lack of meaningful bonuses, or even if it's just because the race is bad in general. Finally, we have the weak ranking, where these factions have no good bonuses, weak armies, weak economy, and they just start out in horrible locations, where they have to fight really strong enemies, which just box you into a corner for the majority of a campaign. So let's begin with Beastmen, and Thorax, I don't think needs much reasoning as to why he is going to be on top of the overpowered ranking. Beastmen as a race are already really powerful, but Thorax just takes this to a whole nother level with how quickly he can snowball his campaign. As for the rest of them, I do believe they fall under the strong category. Some might say they are all overpowered because it is difficult to lose a Beastman campaign, but honestly just existing isn't enough to be called strong, and for most of them, it takes a bit of time to actually get their campaign going. Strongest to weakest should be Khazrak, then Malagor, and finally Mulgar. Next we have Daniel, and immediately just weak. There is nothing you can tell me that is going to change my mind. I have played 4 long campaigns of Daniel. One reaching up to turn 400, where I just experimented with everything his faction has to offer, and I was honestly not impressed. His campaign mechanics are decent, but his empire building sucks. His armies are also very difficult to build, especially if you don't go undivided, as locally you can only have a maximum of 3 recruit capacity if you choose the right commandment. And this is without having lords that have gone down their blue line. Globally, you can also only have 3 recruit capacity, which is, again, really bad. Armies that are devoted to a single chaos god will take ages to recruit and to get to the front, unless you are exclusively devoting to a single god, in which case why not just play the superior corresponding campaign. Mix and match armies are very suboptimal and are rather frustrating to use, and this entire campaign just needs to be reworked from the ground up. Next up we have Bretonnia, and here I do have a bit of a dilemma. So if I was taking into consideration free Knights exploit, where you can just have Knight units that cost you 0 income, I would place every Bretonnian faction in the OP ranking. But if we don't take that into consideration, it would go something along the lines of this. The Fae I would consider at the bottom of strong ranking, as she does have the best bonuses out of all the Bretonnians, with a decent start position from where you can consolidate your regions, kill any dangerous enemies early on, and just start growing your campaign from there. Rapunzel would be at the bottom of mediocre ranking for similar reasons, only worse bonuses. But Luen and Alberic would both be weak. Why Luen and Alberic are weak is because of their start position. So Alberic starts in the worst continent of all, Lustria, which has terrible maps for cavalry, and you have no good allies there. As for Luen, he starts off already having met most Norscans and Be'lakor, which are just gonna declare war on you the first chance they get. So in order to deal with them, you would have to set sail and start conquering Norsca, which is the biggest mistake you can make early on, as it is all red territory for you. But if you don't, you will simply be beset by armies of monkeys landing on your shores and not letting you progress your campaign. Next we have the Empire, and I'm not 100% certain on this one, but I think Gelt belongs in the OP ranking. Maybe somewhere at the bottom. But this is only if you choose the right options and go back home. If not, he is pretty much just strong. The best options being to take as much money from the Cathayans as you possibly can and go back to the Empire to start conquering either Bretonnia or somewhere in the north of the Empire. Now he is OP because of the triumphant return bonuses and because of his unique mechanic, which just heavily augments your campaign and has bonuses for basically every situation. If you need free money, just abuse your gold wizards. If you need to replenish movement, Heaven's Wizards can do it. If you need to destroy a third of an enemy army instantly, Amethyst Wizards would be more than delighted to. Karl Franz and Elspeth are both going to be strong, but I think that Karl is much stronger than Elspeth. Even though she can have stronger armies, Karl has a much stronger campaign mechanic and a much easier time dealing with threats. Then Volkmar is going to be mediocre, honestly falling from grace. He went from being the strongest to the second weakest Empire faction, sadly. And finally, Marcus Wolfhard, who is the weakest of them all, and goes into the weak ranking. Again, starts in Lustria, a mechanic that punishes you for doing well, heroes that bug out and don't progress if they are ever wounded, and the reinforcements you get from your homeland are always the exact same, so they don't even spice up your campaign. Next we have Grand Cathay, and Yuanbo is going to be in the strong ranking. His unique faction mechanic makes his campaign extremely powerful. His biggest problem is the fact that he starts off in Lustria. If not for that, he might have even been higher ranked. Zhao Ming is somewhere at the top of the mediocre ranking, borderline strong, but his biggest problem is lack of any good bonuses, otherwise he would be in the strong ranking. As for Miao Ying, she kinda has better bonuses than Zhao Ming, but much worse campaign start position, which if you aren't careful can lead to a disastrous campaign. But as Zhao Ming, she's going to be in the mediocre ranking, although somewhere at the bottom. Alright, next we have the High Elves, and they will go something along the lines of this. Alisanar, Tyrion, Alariel, and Elsarion all go into the strong category. Now, all of them are quite powerful due to their faction bonuses, armies, mechanics, and overall High Elves being extremely strong in general. When it comes to Imrik, however, I would put him as mediocre. Even though he isn't weak by any means, he starts surrounded by enemies and the beginning of his campaign is fairly difficult. You're also isolated from the other High Elves, so it is very difficult to have allies, and his faction mechanic isn't as powerful as you might think. As for Teclis, well, he is awful, and just goes into the weak category. Barely any better than Marcus or Daniel really, starting off next to the bird and a lot of lizards, with next to no good bonuses, honestly just really sucks. Next are the Greenskins, and so far I don't think too many people would disagree with me in the ranking, but here I expect a little bit of pushback, as I'm going to put Grom and Skarsnik as both overpowered. The answer is quite simple: Gobbos. Trashy units are extremely powerful in this game, and you can have multiple armies of them. And goblins perform quite well, both in auto-resolve and in manually resolved battles. Both Grom and Skarsnik take this to the absolute extremes, with Grom making every one of his Gobbo armies into borderline doom stacks, and Skarsnik being able to get 2 armies for every one the other Greenskins can bring. By turn 15, you are already strength rank 1, and nothing in the game can ever even come close to stopping you. As for the rest of them, I would say they're all fairly strong, with maybe Wurzak contending for last place, maybe even outside of the strong ranking, but for now I will leave him at strong. Next we have the Vampire Counts, and they're all OP. There is not a single Vampire Counts faction you can say is not OP. Zombies work best with Ghosts, but you can use them effectively in every faction, and conquering the map is more of a chore rather than an actual challenge. Next are the Dawi, and I'm probably going to get a lot of pushback here, but sadly not for the highest ranking, which I find hilarious, but I'll put Ungrim Iron Fist as OP. You might be asking why, and the answer is kinda complicated. First off is because how efficient he can make Slayer Pirates be. He recruits them at fairly low cost, you can lower their upkeep cost in a multitude of different ways, you can boost their stats by quite a bit, and if you play the campaign recruiting only Slayer Lords with mostly Slayer Pirates, your armies will actually be cheaper than most mid-tier and high-tier Dawi armies, while also being a bit stronger. Their faction bonus also makes all Slayer Shrines 75% cheaper, something that would not have been overly useful before the Thrones of Decay update. But with the addition of the income building that reduces construction cost even further, you can lower the construction cost to 0. So why does this matter? Well, the answer is because you can build the building for 0 income and after 5 turns demolish it for 1,800 income. In the beginning, this will be for every 5 turns, for every building 1,800 income, but later on you can lower it down to 3 turns. And with more territory you capture, the more you will be able to do it. So 10 regions is 18,000 income per 3 turns, 100 regions is 180,000 income per 3 turns, and so on. It basically gives you an extra income building and lets you recruit and maintain more Slayer Pirate armies than you otherwise would be able to. Yeah, I have gone too deep in the Slayer pill unfortunately, and there is no going back now. As for the rest of them, Malachi is fairly strong, so I'll put him in the strong ranking, with interesting mechanics, and can make some of the strongest armies in the game. Every other Dawi, however, falls short of the strong ranking, and I would put him in the middle of mediocrity, with the strongest being Thoric and the weakest being Grombrindle. Next up is Skaven, and I already know I will get a lot of complaints here. Alright, so Ikitclaw, Throt, Queek, and Tzeentch all fall under the strong ranking, and I think in that order. I don't think any of them can be called overpowered, even though Skaven as a race are fairly strong, and many people think they are OP. The problem is, they're kinda not in this game. Warhammer 2 Skaven put Warhammer 3 Skaven to shame simply because the AI is much worse in this game, and the difficulty is much lower. Take for example Slaanesh. Many people will say, oh, but he has the ability to destroy a faction by plunging it into anarchy and making strong enemies disappear. The problem with that is that there are no strong enemies in this game. The largest enemy I have ever faced as the Skaven is a 40 settlement Karl Franz on turn 100, but unfortunately by that point he was just free food for me. Ikitclaw has some of the best Doom stacks for the Skaven, but Doom stacks are no longer the best way to play the game. Throt is actually still quite strong. As for Queek, well, people underestimate just how cost-effective clan res can be, and with Queek giving them bonuses from Carrick 8 peaks and making them cheaper, sheer numbers help him keep up with the previous 3, which I honestly think is a better way of playing Skaven. Now, Lord Skrolk is mediocre simply due to his starting position, as honestly nobody wants to be in Lustria, or fight Gorok for that matter. And Tzeentch, well, do I really need to say anything? He goes into the weak ranking, but is probably the strongest in it. Next are the Tomb Kings, and when comparing them to everybody else, they just feel awful. Surprisingly though, not all of them are weak. Arkan is actually at the very bottom of the strong ranking, simply because he starts out with an extra army, and you will be surprised just how much that actually means for the beginning of your campaigns. Cathay, even though not that much better than Cetra or Khalida, can have a much stronger late game campaign due to the lesser cost of the Mortuary Cult, and he will go down at the bottom of mediocre ranking. As for Cetra and Khalida, well, I will place them both as weak. Khalida probably at the very bottom, and Cetra somewhere in the middle. Probably still better than Teclis. Now come the Dark Elves, and they are a tricky bunch to rank. Their campaigns mostly feel awful to play, but they are fairly strong. I would say that every single one of their factions belongs in the strong ranking. The strongest being Lokir, after who comes Rakars, and the rest I honestly couldn't tell you. They have no factions that are actually weak, such as how the High Elves have Teclis or Imrik, as it doesn't really matter where they start out. Everybody hates you anyways, and being next to more Dark Elves isn't gonna help much. Maybe for Malekith it kinda does help his campaign, but aside from Malekith it doesn't really matter for the others. And the weakest of them I would have to say is Malus Darkblade, but even he starts out with a Black Arc, which will help you out quite a bit in your early campaign. So really I can't even put him as lower ranked than strong. Next we have the Lizards, and I personally hate playing the Lizardmen, and do think they are fairly weak and could go with an update, but I don't think they belong in the weak category. The Hanuin is surprisingly another OP faction, and I have been saying how upkeep cost reduction is extremely strong in Game 3, and the Hanuin has a follower that reduces the upkeep cost of all units in that army, regardless if it's attached to a lord or hero, by 20%. This way you can make just ridiculously cheap armies and flood the world with Lizardmen. He also has a follower that he can get through his unique mechanic that reduces the construction cost for buildings to 0. So really, if you ever want to flood the world in lizards, play the Hanuin. Oxiodal is also a very strong lizardman. Maybe not in the traditional sense, but he can go around the world, collect some decent bonuses, and accumulate a large wealth very early on. Not to mention that all territory for him is green, so it doesn't really matter where you're situated. And I will place them in the strong ranking. When it comes to the others, even Nakai, I would have to say they all perform decently well with strong armies, but a rather poor economy, which is why I will place them somewhere in the middle of mediocrity. Next up are Ogres, Ogres my lord, and I really hate Ogres. I would place them both as weak, but honestly you could say that Scrag has a mediocre campaign, so I will place them in the mediocre ranking. As for Greases, I mean, he just has a horrible start position. He's next to really strong enemies. The Mountains of Morn are just awful for Ogres that can't even use the underway stance, so I really just have to put him as weak. It doesn't matter that he has a extra camp capacity, it's just an awful campaign. Next are the Wood Elves, and they are also a tricky bunch to rank, especially since they don't play like the other races at all. Except for maybe the Warriors of Chaos, but the Warriors of Chaos are leagues better. If I were to judge them like I judge other factions, I would have to put them all into weak ranking and Orion in the overpowered ranking. But taking into consideration that you're supposed to play around your forest as a end-turn simulator, I would say that aside from Orion, who's going to be in the strong, not OP ranking, the rest of them will fall under the mediocre ranking, with Sisters being strongest, Draika afterwards, and then Dursu. Now, why Orion isn't OP in my opinion is because even though he can have 3 armies, that is only if he is at war with every other faction in the game. A small price to pay for 3 armies, true, but to what end? Your campaign isn't going to boom like it would with any other race, where conquering the world would mean having a much stronger campaign. It would honestly be pointless. And don't forget that the longer his campaign lasts, the weaker he will become, as there will be no more enemies to fight. Honestly, you would just have an easier campaign, playing it diplomatically and securing your borders, and never expanding. Sounds stupid, but so is the way their campaign is designed. And if I were judging them by any other standard, like I said, Orion would be OP and the rest of them would be weak, even by Tomb King standards. Next are the Warriors of Chaos, and they have 2 characters that are in the OP ranking, Archaon and Be'lakor. Both of them are extremely strong and have amazing faction bonuses, with Be'lakor being slightly stronger early on, and Archaon getting stronger over time as he accumulates vassals. Not to mention they can both confederate the other Warrior of Chaos legendary lords. Every other Warriors of Chaos faction will fall under the strong ranking, as Warriors of Chaos are an extremely strong race, but the rest of the lords just aren't as strong as Archaon and Be'lakor. Next up is Vampire Coast, and I'm just going to place them all in mediocre except for Count Noculus, who does have some decent bonuses for his army, making them a lot stronger than they should be, especially with how cheap you can get them. And again, I know a lot of people will complain here, especially with Count Noculus. Many people think he is overpowered because of his start position. But again, what good is to just stay alive? The player that's AFK isn't the best just because he died the least. It just doesn't work like that. The rest of the Vampire Pirates have rather lackluster bonuses and are just overall poorly designed. But since they also have some decent mechanics with Raise the Dead, I can't be too harsh on them. Kislev was also rather difficult for me to rank. I would have to say that Catherine and Kistalton are somewhere at the bottom of strong, just because of how quickly they can confederate every other Kislevite around them, with Ostankia not being that far away or maybe at the top of the mediocre ranking, just because it is very hard to lose battles when you have access to blessings and curses, but since she is so far from the other Kislevites, her start position is really hindering her quite a bit. Boris, I would have liked to place him at mediocre ranking at least. But considering the last time I played him, capturing Chaos Waste was bugged and didn't give you devotion per turn as it states. So in order to maintain your Chaos Waste territory, you have to activate the Wards of Climate Change, which cost you devotion, which you should be getting from your Chaos Waste settlements, but since they are bugged and don't actually give you devotion per turn, yeah, you run out of devotion real quick, and you can't even use the invocations of the Motherland. So in the end, I just have to place him as weak. Next is Norsca, and there isn't much to talk about here. I think that Strog is OP simply because of how quickly he can get troll armies going, and they are basically unstoppable. The campaign is over by turn 30. As for Wulfric, he is a lot tougher to determine, but I think he belongs somewhere in the mediocre ranking. Now, it's not because he has worse bonuses than Strog, that's not it, but rather because of his start position. Nobody likes you, and everybody is going to declare war on you the first chance they get. So no marauding for you, instead you have to sit at home and defend your territory from all sides. Which, let me tell you, after playing 3 Wulfric campaigns and having to kill Bilious Thundergraph 3 times in a single turn, I just want to pull out any little bit of hair I have left. Next up is Tzeentch, and here we have the first game-breaking faction, the Changeling. Need I say any more? As for Kairos, he does have some good mechanics, but his start position is horrible, surrounded by some major opponents who will give you a hard time, not to mention all of your territory is quite exposed, so I will have to place him as weak. Then we have Nurgle, that is surprisingly good now. I really enjoy playing Nurgle for a change. Damacon, I must say, is quite powerful, and I will place him as strong. Epidemius is also decent. So long as you let Archeon deal with Boris, you will have a pleasant campaign. I would say, though, that he is somewhat mediocre in terms of strength. And Kugath, I'm sorry, but he is still weak. Not the weakest, mind you, but still weak. Then we have Skarbrand, and who is surprised here, he is the other game-breaking character. Considering you can end the campaign by turn 8, I don't think I need to say more. Next we have Slaanesh, and I'm not quite sure where to place Nakari. I think I was being too generous in my previous assessment of him, so maybe a bit lower ranked this time. I would still place him as somewhere at either the bottom of strong ranking or top of mediocre ranking. I can't really decide, so I'm gonna place him as top of mediocre. His mechanics are amazing, his economy is good, his armies are strong as well as his characters, but the replenishment is awful still, and the auto-resolve is just a crime against humanity. And finally, we have the Chaos Dwarfs. Now, I believe Astragoth's Iron Hand belongs in the OP ranking, and it is simply due to the Tower of Zar. I think people underestimate just how powerful it can be and how good the bonuses truly are. The faster you can claim it for yourself, and the faster you confederate the other Chaos Dwarfs, the stronger your campaign will become, and you will simply boom out of proportion. As for Dreshoas, he is strong, somewhere at the top of the strong ranking, and Zatan I think is at the bottom of the strong ranking. Because I think Zatan just has the worst bonuses out of all of them, but he is still a Chaos Dwarf, which is ridiculously strong on its own. And there you have it. Some factions I think I could have ranked better if I had played them thoroughly, but I think that most of them are exactly where they should be. Do you agree with my choices or disagree? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe for future content. Thank you all for watching, and until next time.
Khorne fights as one.